Howliday Inn by James Howe. Chapter 5. She's Gone. The next morning I was startled out of my sleep by the sound of Harrison's voice. "Oh no!" he cried. I moved quickly to the front of my bungalow to see what was going on. So did everyone else. Harrison stood in the center of the compound, shaking his head as Jill flew out the front door. "What is it?" she shouted. "What's happened?" Harrison pointed at Louise's bungalow. The door was wide open. "She's gone!" he proclaimed. Immediately I shifted my gaze to Max. Our eyes met. His jaw fell open as a look of shock and bewilderment swept over him. "But how?" Jill asked. "This has never happened before, has it?" "Not in the 3 summers I've worked here," Harrison replied. Slowly he surveyed the entire compound, looking at each of us in turn. Then suddenly he called out, "Look!" We all turned our heads sharply in the direction he was pointing. Unfortunately, I hit my nose on the wall of my bungalow and I couldn't see a thing except stars. So it took Jill's words to make clear of what it was that had astonished him. "Oh no!" she said. "The gate is open." "How can that be?" Harrison asked. "There's no way any of the animals could open that lock." "I don't know," Jill said, her brow wrinkled in confusion and distress. "Unless one of us—" She stopped speaking then, and a strange expression came over her face. "What is it?" Harrison asked. "What's the matter?" "I did it," she said after a minute. Her voice was soft and a little wavery. "What do you mean?" Harrison queried. His eyebrows came together to form a hedge across his forehead. "I did it," Jill repeated. "Don't I left the gate open. Don't you remember? When I ran in to get the towels, I accidentally left the office door locked behind me. So I had to go back by the gate. I was in such a hurry, and it was raining so badly, I guess I just didn't notice. I—" Her shoulders slumped, and it was another moment before she spoke again. In the interim, a flash of lightning ripped through the sky, letting us know that the storm was not yet over. "Oh, I feel so terrible," Jill went on. "It's all my fault. What are we going to do?" Much to my surprise, Harrison came over to Jill and put his arms around her shoulder. "Don't worry," he said softly. "We'll find her. It was a mistake. It could have happened to anyone. Come on, let's give everyone breakfast, and then you and I'll go out looking for her." Jill seemed as surprised as I was at Harrison's concern. She looked at him warily out of her corner of her eyes. "What if we don't find her?" she asked. "Then she'll find us," Harrison said calmly. "She'll wind her way back home sooner or later." He smiled then and said gently, "Oh, okay." "Okay," Jill replied, accepting Harrison's attempts at reassurance, and together they went back inside the office. After breakfast, Chester and I put our heads together to consider Louise's escape. Harrison and Jill had let us out early for exercise, since there was no way of knowing when the storm would start up again. "What did I tell you?" Chester asked me. "I give up," I answered, not at all sure what he was referring to. "Didn't I say there would be trouble?" "What trouble?" I countered. "Louise ran away. Makes sense if you ask me." "Oh, really?" "Sure." "Would you care to enlarge on your theory?" "I'd be delighted," I replied. "Louise was very upset about Max's flirting with Georgette. Agreed?" "Agreed." "So, when she saw that the front gate had been left open last night, she seized the opportunity to run off and teach Max a lesson. She'll be back." "And that's it?" "Simple, really. Just opened the door to her bungalow and out she went." "Mm-hmm," Chester replied, licking his paws. His long tongue moved slowly between each of his toes as he reflected on what I'd said. No doubt he was impressed with my powers of deduction. "And did she unlock Max's door, too?" "Huh?" I asked, completely thrown. "What do you mean?" "What I mean is that Max's door was open this morning, too. You may not have noticed that like I did. You have to learn to be observant in this business, Harold. What business is that, Chester? The business of crime detection, answered, neatly snapping his head in my direction to look me squarely in the eyes. Crime detection? I responded. I could feel the hairs along the back of my neck rise slightly. Chester had always had the ability to alarm me, often unnecessarily. I was hoping this was the one case. Chester, I said, I think you're getting carried away. On the contrary, he replied, it may well have been Louise who was carried away. Oh, was all I could say, for Max's voice suddenly bellowed throughout Chateau Bow Wow. It's no good, he groaned. No good. Chester and I looked out to see him sitting in the middle of the compound, a forlorn expression smeared across his face like the after breakfast jam. The ever present Georgette was at his side. Now, Max, you mustn't carry on so, she said softly. Hussy, I heard myself utter under my breath. I can't help it, Georgette, Max cried, his voice cracking. It's all my fault this happened. I never should have spoken to her that way I did. I could see Taxi moving in Max's direction. Max looked up and I saw him coming. I'm sorry, Max. Taxi started to say. Not now, Taxi, Max fairly shouted. But Max, no taxi, I want to be alone. And Max picked himself up and lumbered back to his bungalow. Georgette followed. He turned to her suddenly and said, Please, Georgette, I need some space. Of course, she answered, her feathery voice at its featheriest. I understand. This is not the time for us. She turned and walked away, her spirit trailing behind her, like a long shadow on a sultry summer day. Taxi, meanwhile, stood in the center of the compound. From a look on his face, he was not pleased that Max had dismissed him so abruptly. After a moment's deliberation, he moved away toward one corner of the compound and began to scratch himself behind the ears. Come on, Chester said to me. We've got some exploring to do. Okay, I answered, but I don't know what you expect to find. Anyway, if you're suspecting Max of anything, I guess you can rule him out now. Boy, is he upset, poor fella. Is he? Chester asked pointedly. Perhaps, perhaps he is a poor fellow, as you say, or perhaps a poor fella putting on a show. We were walking in the direction of Louise's bungalow when we bumped into Howard and Heather. They both jumped in surprise. Sorry, I said. I didn't mean to startle you. Oh, it's nothing, Howard said. No, it's nothing at all, said Heather. Oh my, I'm so jumpy today. I don't feel quite myself. No, Sorry about the beastly howling last night, old chap, Howard said to me. He turned with a nod to Chester. Certainly hope we weren't the case of Louise's, departure, Heather added. She giggled suddenly, and then, just as suddenly, she gasped and tried to catch her breath. What is it? Howard cried. Oh, it's nothing, Heather replied, after letting out a great sigh. I'm having such trouble breathing today. I don't know what it is. She looked at Howard, her big eyes wide in bewilderment. The two of them stared at each other for a long moment, their heads bobbing up and down in unison. I think we'd better, Howard began. Go home, Heather finished. Yes, dear. We'd Yes, dear, I think we'd best. Do excuse us, she said, turning to us. I'm not herself, said Howard, and they turned and left. Chester and I watched them go. Typical werewolfian behavior, said Chester, his voice full of authority. I'm sure I would have asked him to elaborate if it were not for the fact that I didn't really care in the least what he had to say. So I changed the subject. Weren't we going to do some exploring? I asked. Yes, Chester added, snapping himself out of his pensive mood. Follow me. I followed Chester to Louise's bungalow, where we stood for what felt like a long time, staring at the emptiness inside. Just think, I said, feeling a tear come out of my eye. Last night she was here. Today she's gone. Yes, said Chester slowly. That's exactly the word. Gone. Escaped, I added. But soon she'll be back with us. Nonsense, Chester said scornfully. She didn't escape. She won't be back. No one comes back from murder. Murder? Of course, murder, Chester replied evenly. It's all falling into place, don't you see? What's falling into place? The suspects, the motives, and now the evidence, said Chester. I was confused, which around Chester is a normal state of being, so it didn't alarm me. What evidence? I asked. Look for yourself, he said with a nod toward the bungalow. What do you see? I surveyed the interior. A rug, a water dish, a food dish, I said, just like mine. Ah, but it isn't just like yours, Harold, and that's the key. Why? I don't see anything different. Look again, and this time use your powers of observation, such as they are. Now, what do you see? I scrunched up my eyes and looked carefully at each square inch of space, as if studying for a final exam in obedience school. Well, Chester prodded. A rug, a water dish, a food dish, I proclaimed. Chester sighed and shook his head sadly. Sometimes I despair, Harold, he uttered. Allow me to fill you in on what you've missed. Please do. The rug. How is it different from yours? I shrugged. It's all jumbled up, Chester went on. A real mess, in fact. And the food dish? Almost filled with food. These observations may seem insignificant, but wait, my friend. Now we come to the water dish, perhaps the most significant item in all. And yet, it isn't really the water dish, but what lies around it that is so disturbing. Thoroughly confused, I looked at the water dish and the floor around it. Nothing struck me as unusual. But don't you see? Chester asked. What is lying all around the water dish? Water? I ventured. Exactly! He exclaimed triumphantly. But what else would you expect to find around a water dish? Ordinarily, the appearance of water around a water dish would not be out of the ordinary in the least. But given the unusual combination of factors, it is most striking, and it will be given serious consideration of our investigation. Suddenly, Lyle zoomed by us. Faster than a speeding bullet, I heard him call out as he passed. Able to leap buildings in a single bound. Chester shook his head. That Lyle is a disgrace to the species, he said. Then, back on the track of his previous thought, he said, Come on, Harold. I need to talk this out with you right now. We found a quiet spot under a tree in a corner of the compound. The storm seemed to have abated for the moment, and I thought how pleasant it would be to just lie here for a while and commune with nature. But Chester had other ideas. The rug, the food dish, and the water on the floor all add up to foul play, my dear Harold. Don't you see? Signs of a struggle, old boy. Old boy, I thought. My guess, and it's only a guess, mind you, is that someone pushed Louise's head into the water while she was drinking. She resisted, which accounts for the spilled water and the wrinkled rug. And the food? I asked. She never finished her dinner, Chester said simply. She was, shall we say, interrupted. I must confess, Chester's deductions began to awaken in me the possibility that what he was suspecting was true. Still, I wasn't going to give up my theory of Louise's escape so easily. What if it happened just as Jill and Harrison said? I asked. Isn't that possible? Sure, it's possible, Chester answered, but it's unlikely. Why? If Louise had run away, it's only logical she would have finished eating her dinner first, since she couldn't have known when she'd be eating her next meal. And why the appearance of a struggle? And why, Chester added, was Max's door open as well? So you're saying Max did it? I'm not saying anything yet.
Obviously, Max had the motive and the strength to pull it off. Let us picture the scene. He comes to Louise's bungalow telling her he wants to apologize. She lets him in. He pushes her head into the water. She struggles, but he has the strength to hold her down. Afterward, he drags her body out through the front gate.
But he's so upset today, I said, still not believing Max capable of such an act.
Either that, or, as I suggested before, he's pretending he is to throw us off, you see.
I allowed, as how I did. What about Georgette? I asked. She could have done it. I wouldn't put much past her.
Yes, that's possible too. The only problem there is that I doubt she has the strength to hold Louisa's head down. What's more likely is that they're in cahoots, she and Max. She may have been his accomplice, unless, of course.
And here Chester thought for a moment.
I have the method of the murder itself wrong. That will bear some thinking.
In the distance, Lyle dropped from the branch of a tree onto Taxi's head. Taxi, not in the mood to wear Lyle as a hat, shook him off so violently that he landed several feet away. Stunned, he picked himself up and screamed at Taxi.
I can tell when I'm not wanted. Don't think I can't take a hint.
And he stormed off. What about Lyle? I asked. Do you remember how he threatened Louise yesterday?
Indeed, I do,
Chester answered, nodding slowly.
You haven't seen the end of me, he said. Just watch out.
And you know, Harold,
Lyle is just crazy enough to do it. When you think about it, the murderer could be anyone here.
Anyone? I asked, puzzled.
Anyone, Chester affirmed. We know, for instance, that Howard and Heather were part werewolf.
You know,
I corrected. Oh, come on, Harold. No normal dogs howl like that.
That's true, I concurred. I don't.
True, of course. You're not normal either. But we'll overlook that for a moment.
Thank you, I said.
Besides, werewolves are very hairy. Look at how hairy Heather and Howard are.
They're wire-haired dachshunds. You said so yourself.
They're very hairy, wire-haired dachshunds,
Chester countered, refusing to allow logic to blow his theory.
And if they're werewolves, they can change shape anytime they want.
Huh? I inquired.
Werewolves can change into anything, anytime at all, in order to assist them in their pursuit of evil.
I tried to imagine Howard and Heather changing shape. It was hard to picture Howard as a clothes hanger or Heather as a toaster oven. I was about to mention this to Chester when he spoke again.
You have to admit, they were behaving strangely today, he added. Guilt, Harold. They were consumed with guilt.
I said, I doubt werewolves feel guilty.
The guilt comes from the wire-haired dachshund part of them. It's common in the breed.
Oh, I replied. And what about Harrison and Jill? Do you suspect them too?
Of course, said Chester. They're both a little on the shady side, if you ask me. Besides, we don't know the whole story on this Dr. Greenbrier yet. If you want my opinion, it's more than a little strange that he's gone off and left us in the care of these two. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they're acting on his orders.
What are you implying?
I'm not implying anything, Chester answered innocently. I'm just thinking out loud. It's interesting, that's all, that while the doctor is away, Louise disappears, and neither Harrison nor Jill seem too concerned about letting him know.
Maybe they want to find Louise first, I suggested.
Or maybe Greenbrier has ordered them to murder her.
Oh, Chester, I said. This last was too much. What about Jill? Didn't you see how upset she was?
Again, like Max, she could be faking. Or,
and here he paused for a moment, perhaps
perhaps Harrison is in it alone with the not-so-good doctor. That's a possibility, too.
My head was spinning with Chester's theories. Then I thought of the one suspect he'd left out. In Taxi? I asked. He's too dumb to concoct a murder like this. I didn't like saying it about Taxi, but it was true. Chester didn't agree.
You don't have to be a genius to murder Harold. No, it isn't Taxi's intelligence that troubles me. It's his strength. He's a timid little fellow. I can't imagine him holding Louise down long enough to.
Here, Chester drifted off into his thought. Suddenly his eyes lit up.
Unless,
He said excitedly.
if we change the method of murder, then
Yes,
we know that Taxi is always buttering up to Max, right?
right.
I agreed. And we know that his feelings were hurt yesterday when Max went off with Georgette instead of spending time with him. We also know he'd do anything to please Max to get back into his good graces.
But murder?
I asked.
I couldn't believe it of Taxi.
Sure, why not? I was on the wrong track, don't you see? Taxi? If we believe that Louise was drowned, then Taxi is pretty much ruled out. He wouldn't have the strength, and I doubt that he'd have the guts. But if the method of murder were less direct, if, for instance,
And he paused dramatically.
Louise were poisoned,
I felt a jolt go through me. Chester!
I cried. What is it?
I just remembered something Taxi said yesterday. Max had just gotten through telling us how sometimes he thought he'd be better off with women.
Yes?
And Taxi told us about a television program he'd seen where a man, feeling the same way, murdered his wife.
And the method, Harold? What method did he use?
Poison. Chester and I sat very still for a moment. My gaze drifted to where I had seen Taxi sitting a few moments before. He was no longer there. Could it be, I asked myself, could Taxi have murdered Louise to please Max? What kind of warped mind existed within that peculiar little body of his? I turned my head, then, and much to my surprise, saw that Taxi was sitting a few feet away. He stared at me in such a cold way that I knew he'd heard every word Chester and I said without him. Taxi! I said, startled. He didn't respond, but continued to glare. I swallowed hard and tried to speak again. I'm. Taxi cut me off with a menacing growl, and before I could get another word past my lips, he turned and walked away. He heard, I said then to Chester. Yes, was all Chester said in reply. But there was something in the way he said it that sent a shiver down my spine. Chapter 6. The Cat Who Knew Too Much. Without warning, the sky opened and the rain came down. Lyle and Taxi ran for the shelter of their bungalows. Georgette ran to Max's, and he made no sign for her to leave. Interesting, I thought. Even more interesting was the fact that I was sitting in the middle of a pouring rain watching everyone else run for cover. Come on, Chester, I called out. Let's go.
Don't be ridiculous, he shouted back. Now is the perfect time for us to investigate.
Perfect time? I asked. Investigate, are you crazy? It's pouring.
I know. But Max and Georgette are together, and if we're clever about it, we can eavesdrop on them without their noticing. Follow me.
I didn't budge. I couldn't believe Chester wanted to play detective in the middle of a storm. I was all set to return to my bungalow, but the next words he spoke got me.
If not for me, do it for Louise.
As we approached Max's bungalow, Chester stopped and beckoned for me to bend down. He whispered,
If we could get up on the roof, we could lean over and hear everything. Give me a boost.
How am I supposed to do that? I asked. But Chester had already jumped up on my shoulders, and from there to the top of the bungalow. Oh, I said in answer to my own question. Seeing that I had no one's shoulders to assist me, I had little choice but to take a running leap.
Softly,
Chester commanded as I landed next to him with a crash.
Nice move,
he commented. I'm not as quiet as you are, Chester, I said. I can't help it. I'm big.
And clumsy. Well, never mind.
If they heard us, I'll just say, ho, 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 and tell them Christmas is early this year. We hung over the front of the bungalow, listening as best as we could. The rain was coming down even harder now, making it impossible to hear what was being said inside. We couldn't see anything either, because the door was just lower than either of us could reach our heads.
Listen,
Chester said in a low voice.
I've got to get closer. If you hold me with your front legs, I'll be able to hang down on top of the door and hear and see what's going on inside.
Well, I wasn't sure this was such a good idea. But, as you may have figured out by yourself now, once Chester had a notion in his head, there's no arguing with it. I held onto his back legs with my paws and lowered him to the front door. His tail brushed against my nose. It tickled.
Chester,
I whispered as loudly as I could. Move your tail.
what?
He whispered back. Move your tail. It's tickling my nose.
I can't hear you, Harold. Now be quiet. I think I can make out what they're saying. Lower me a little more.
I pushed myself forward an inch or two in order to lower Chester. With the rain coming down and and the way it was, the roof was getting pretty slippery, and I didn't dare go much further. How's that? I called out. Chester couldn't hear me, so he didn't answer. Apparently, it had worked, though, because I could see that his ears were standing up sharply. A good sign that he was able to hear something. Whatever he was hearing must have been good, because his tail started twitching like crazy. Unfortunately, it was twitching like crazy all over my nose. Stop it! I cried as the tears started rolling down my face. Boy, did that tickle. Chester! Chester! I called out. But by now the rain was really coming down and he couldn't hear a word I said. No matter which way I turned my head, Chester's tail found my nose. Chester, you're making me laugh! I cried out desperately. I could feel myself starting to slip off the roof. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. Without realizing what I was doing, I let go of Chester's legs and grabbed his tail. He plunged downward, pulling me off with him. Off the slippery roof I tumbled, holding Chester tightly by the tail. Together we landed in a jumble right in front of the door to the bungalow. Max and Georgette turned to discover us lying in a puddle at their doorstep. Look, Max, Georgette said. It's raining cats and dogs. She seemed to get quite a chuckle out of that, but Max hushed her immediately. Georgette, how can you laugh at a time like this? But, Sugar. Enough now. Be still. Chester glanced at me knowingly. So, Max said, turning to us, to what do we owe the pleasure of your, shall we say, unexpected company? We were just in the neighborhood, so we thought we'd drop in, Chester replied smartly. I was impressed by the quickness of his wit. I tried to think of a quick comeback too, but it takes me a while to think of quick comebacks. By the time I was ready, Chester had already strolled into the bungalow, casually shaking out the rain from his hair as he went. I followed his lead, but when I shook the rain out of my hair, there was nothing casual about it. Harold, Sugar, Georgette cried, you're making it rain indoors. Oh, sorry, I said sheepishly. Well, it was nice of you to stop by anyway, she said then. I guess. She looked with uncertainty at Max, who glowered at Chester and said nothing. After an awkward silence, Chester spoke. We were sorry to hear about Louise. If there's anything we can do. Ah, shucks, Max said, his face softening. That's really big of you.
I mean, if we can help you out in any way,
Chester added with emphasis. He looked meaningfully at Max. Max averted his eyes and pawed at the ground. Oh, I doubt there's anything anyone can do, he mumbled. Well, we'll just hope she comes back soon, that's all. Meanwhile, I'll just have to bear my sorrow alone. Chester nodded sympathetically at Max.
Of course, he said, we understand. And then under his breath he muttered, save it for the judge.
What about me? Georgette added. I'll bear it with you, Maxie. Gee, thanks, Georgette. I noticed Chester's face out of the corner of one eye. He was taking it all in. Well, I suppose you're right, he said. There really isn't anything we can do. Just wanted to let you know. He paused dramatically and spoke with great intensity. That we're here if you need us. Right, Max said, sticking out his jaw. I gathered that for a bulldog, a stiff lower jaw was the equivalent of a stiff upper lip for the rest of us. The rain was letting up, a perfect excuse for us to take our leave. We raced back to Chester's bungalow.
Well, I couldn't hear anything, Chester said as soon as we were inside. But what I did hear was pretty incriminating.
What do you mean?
I asked. It means it's not the kind of stuff you'd want your mother to know.
Oh? Chester bathed himself as he continued.
It seems,
He said between licks,
that our friends, Max and Georgette, are planning to escape.
Really? I asked. I could feel my eyebrows take on a life of their own.
Really, Chester replied. The first voice I heard was Georgette's. She was saying something like, "We have to stick together and everything will be all right."
Wow.
That's what I thought. Then Max said, "But what if we're caught?" And Georgette said, "That's why we have to be very careful. We'll go when it's dark. First, we have to find a way out." And that's all I heard.
That's too bad, I said.
Yes, it is, Chester agreed. Unfortunately, a certain party who shall remain nameless dropped me right at the moment.
Oh, I said, swallowing. I decided not to respond further. Well, I went on, obviously, Max and Georgette are the guilty ones. They murdered Louise and now they're planning their getaway. Gee, it's hard to believe it's really happening. It's like something you would read in a detective story.
Not so fast,
Chester continued.
It doesn't look good for them, but I'm still not convinced they did it.
You're not? I asked in surprise.
Not at all,
Chester replied. They're not the only ones with a motive. And there's still
a big piece of the puzzle that doesn't fit. Until it does, I won't know for sure who the murderer is.
What's that?
I asked. Well, Harold, I don't know about you, but I had a lot of trouble sleeping last night. Howard and Heather were howling so much, I don't think I slept at all. If anyone had walked across the compound, much less dragged a body across it, I would have known. But I didn't see or hear anything all night long. Doesn't that seem odd?
I had to admit that it did. What do you make of it? I asked Chester.
I don't know what to make of it, he confessed.
Maybe whoever did it didn't want to get wet, so they waited for the rain to let up, I suggested.
But that would mean early this morning when it was late already. Nope, it would have been too risky.
Then it had to be last night. Chester was deep in thought.
Yes,
he murmured softly.
Yes, last night.
Suddenly his eyes lit up. I was aware that at that moment the rain stopped. It was very still when Chester uttered his next words.
The last piece of the puzzle, Harold.
Yes?
It just fell into place, he said.
Huh?
I just figured it out, Harold.
His voice became louder and more excited.
I don't know why, and I don't completely understand how, but I know who did it, without a doubt. I know who did it.
You
know who did what?
Taxi's voice said sharply. Surprised, I turned to see Taxi, Lyle, Georgette, and Max gathered at the door of Chester's bungalow. It was Max who spoke next. Taxi tells us you and Harold are saying he murdered Louise, he said.
Nonsense,
Chester replied immediately. Nothing seemed to faze him.
He said he overheard you talking. He may have overheard us talking, but he never heard us say he murdered Louise.
You believe that Louise was murdered? Georgette asked, her eyes growing wide. How can you say such a thing?
I say it because it's true,
Chester replied matter of factly. Oh, come on, mate, Max retorted. You have an overstimulated imagination, if you ask me, just like Lyle. I've always said that about cats.
Lyle was outraged. Don't put me in the same camp as Chester, he cried. I may be crazy, but I'm not that crazy. I never accused somebody of murder. He's a troublemaker. String him up. That's what I say. Let's string him up.
Hysterically dashed off, I presumed, in search of rope. Chester stared coolly at the three who remained.
Yes, he said. I know who murdered Louise. I need just a little more information, and when I have it, I'll prove my case.
Max began to laugh.
Go ahead and laugh,
Chester snapped, cutting him off mid-chortle.
Yes, my friend. Laugh today, for tomorrow you'll know the truth. And then perhaps you'll never laugh again.
I noticed that Howard and Heather had come up behind Taxi and were listening to what Chester had to say. I felt myself trembling as I beheld the 5 pairs of eyes staring penetratingly at Chester. It was so quiet you could have heard a doggy poop drop. And then, all at once, Heather threw back her head and let out an ear-splitting howl. "Oh!" she cried. Gasps of shock went through from all of us. She looked about, an expression of great surprise on her face. "So sorry," she said softly. "Just not myself. Oh, how embarrassing. I think I'd best rest," Howard continued. "Yes, dear, I do think that's best." And off they went, their heads bobbing all the way back to their bungalows. We watched them go. Then, without a word, Max, Georgette, and Taxi followed, leaving Chester and me alone with each other and our thoughts. I looked at Chester. A cool smile sat on his lips. "How can you smile like that?" I asked. "Don't you realize what a dangerous thing you've done? Exposing yourself like that? Now the murderer knows you've found him out."
Oh, I don't think I've done such a dangerous thing,
Chester answered smoothly. He was quiet then, and I remember looking at him, hoping that he was right, and feeling somewhere deep in my bones that he wasn't. He was lost in thought for the rest of the day. In fact, the only time he spoke to me again was shortly before dinner.
Just one word of warning, he said. Keep awake tonight. The murderer may strike again. Remember, do not sleep. If you do, you may never wake again.
How it chills me to recall those words, particularly when I think of them as Chester's last.